Speciation is the evolutionary process by which the populations evolve to become distinct species. And the main feature of species is that two different species cannot interbreed with each other. This is the fundamental key for how there is biodiversity. All the organisms are different from each other. They end up forming different species because they cannot co-breed. They cannot breed with each other. So the question is, how do new species form? Before we understand how new species are formed, it's important to understand what are species. The biological species concept, or BSC, says that a species is a group of individuals that cannot interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. The limitation of this definition is that it does not apply to asexual organisms because they cannot be defined on the basis of breeding, and it's difficult to apply on the extinct species or fossils. We will look at the different mechanism of how a species is formed from a population of one particular species. The different methods are allopatric, peripatric, parapatric, or sympatric speciation. So let's look at what these phenomena are. Allopatric speciation is the most important type of speciation. What happens in this is a population in a geographic area is separated from one another through some geographic barrier. So let's say this population is there and then a geographic barrier is built. Some organisms are left here, some organisms are left here, and now they cannot interact with each other. The genetic flow is prevented. So this kind of speciation was seen by the Darwin finches, where because of the formation of these Galapagos islands, they cannot interact with each other. Next kind of speciation is sympatric speciation. So what happens is a population living in the same geographic area somehow becomes different from rest of the members of its population. For example, let's say there's a bird that used to feed on apple, but something happened that some members started feeding on one kind of fruit and the other keep feeding on the previous kind of fruit. So now the organisms which have changed their behavior will become so different that they can no longer breed with the parent species. So this kind of species can arise from certain genetic changes such as polyploidy in plants, or some behavioral changes. That means the mating behavior or the feeding behavior of one small cluster of organisms changes that ends up building so much differences from the parent population that they can no longer interact or breed with them. In peripatric population, the geographic isolation is not built, but the population itself becomes isolated from the parent population. Some population has isolated itself, and now so much genetic change has accumulated in the two organisms, in the two clusters of land, that they can no longer interact or breed with each other. So how is it different from allopatric speciation? In allopatric speciation, some genetic barrier was built by nature, but here the organisms have themselves isolated themselves from the parent population, and because of the accumulation of changes, they cannot breed with their parent population. Now, parapatric speciation is when the two organisms in the same species end up in some different situation. For example, here you can see there is grass that is growing on the mine waste, and there is grass that is growing on the uncontaminated soil. But what has changed is their flowering cycle. When the one kind of grass is flowering, the other is not flowering. So that means the cross pollination between them will not happen. Although they are able to interbreed, but they cannot interbreed just because of the change in their flowering cycle. So we have understood that there are accumulation of changes in different organisms that leads to speciation. But what could be the causes of these changes? These changes can arise from mutations, which lead to genetic variation, or some genetic drift in which one allele becomes more prevalent in a population than compared to the other, or the reproductive barriers, the barrier that prevent the gene flow between the two populations, or natural selection in which the different environment lead to the selection of different kinds of organisms. That selection keeps on going and it leads to the accumulation of more and more different characters, and eventually the two clusters of population cannot breed with each other. So how can the organisms of the same population end up developing reproductive isolation? So the reproductive isolation can be of two kinds. One is pre-zygotic, that is the barrier that exists before there is even a chance of fertilization, and the other is post-zygotic, that means the barriers which exist after the fertilization. That means the fertilization is possible, but there are other kinds of barriers. Now let's see what would be the barriers that prevents the fertilization of an egg and a sperm. First would be temporal isolation. That means the two organisms of the same species are now having a different breeding cycle, or they're having different breeding time, or their breeding behavior is now different, their breeding rituals are different, or there is incompatibility between the reproductive organs. One organism is too big and the other is too small, they cannot mate with each other, and they have maybe different ecological behavior. For example, they would want to live in different habitats. One wants to live on top of the tree, other wants to live in water. Now they do not have the opportunity to come close to each other, so they will never be able to mate or fertilize their sperm and ovum. The other kind of barrier would be post-zygotic. That means although the two organisms can have same reproductive cycle, they may have same reproductive behavior, they might be present in the same geographic location, and they have the opportunity to mate. But still, if they mate with each other, either the hybrid produced by the fusion of two different organisms does not survive, or if it survives, it's sterile. That means it cannot produce offsprings further. So that lineage will not be able to succeed in their progression. Let's study about the Darwin finches. So Darwin went on to study some finches over a cluster of islands called Galapagos Islands. So he observed that these finches present on the different clusters of these Galapagos Islands would have different beak shape depending on what kind of food they eat. This is an example of allopatric speciation. So because of the geographic isolation, these finches were present on different parts of the island, and they had evolved different feeding habits because of the kind of food available, and their physical appearance, their behavior had changed so much that they were no longer able to have a mating event or interbreeding event with each other, and ended up forming different species. Adaptive radiation is the process in which the organisms diversify rapidly into new forms, especially when a change in the environment makes new resources available. Here is the example of Hawaiian honey creepers, which have evolved multiple kinds of species from them depending on what kind of food they eat. For example, if they had nectar available and they had to sip their food, they would be they would have this kind of beak. But if they were feeding on insects, then they would have a probing kind of beaks. And if they were feeding on seeds, they would have crushing kind of beaks. So that was another example of how different kinds of beaks were formed, leading to the formation of different species of birds. Now about the impact of human activity on speciation. Human beings cause habitat fragmentation. That means they are causing populations to become geographically isolated from each other. For example, urbanization leads to the isolation of wildlife population. How might speciation processes apply to current environmental conditions? Under current environmental conditions, there is rapid habitat change and isolation. The climate change, deforestation, urbanization are causing rapid change in the habitat. Many species are becoming isolated due to habitat fragmentation, example wildlife separated by cities, roads, and agricultural farms. This can lead to allopatric speciation, where the population evolves separately due to physical barriers. Climate change and adaptive pressure. Because of the rising temperature, shift in ecosystem, and changing food availability, populations have to undergo adaptive changes to survive these hard temperature conditions or low food availability resources. Over time, natural selection could lead to speciation, as the population adapting to different environmental conditions will have different behaviors. Other factors influenced by human activity is population that produces a lot of pollution and toxins. So changes in soil, air, water quality can also lead to ecological isolation, where certain species no longer share the same habitat or breeding grounds. Changes in the mating behavior, pollution, noise pollution, light pollution can also lead to behavioral isolation. So these changes accumulated in the organisms will make them incapable of breeding with each other. Over time, these reproductive isolation will lead to sympatric speciation. So the organism would be still living in the same geographic area, but their behavior would be so different that they cannot breed with each other. Human beings can not only derive the isolation of organisms but also more opportunities of them meeting. So human driven migration can form these areas called the hybrid zones, where the two different species can meet. These zones may produce hybrid between the two species. Now we know that the hybrid between two different species are generally, they either do not survive or they are sterile. That means they cannot produce fertile offsprings. But over time, fertile hybrids might be formed, and that can lead to the formation of an entirely new species. Human beings are also involved in conservation and speciation process. How? The protected area may unintentionally isolate population, creating a new form of peripatric speciation, or help maintain genetic diversity, promoting speciation. Introducing species into a new environment may lead to evolutionary changes and potential speciation events. Biodiversity loss. Many species are going through extinction at a very rapid rate due to the environmental changes, reducing the opportunity for the natural speciation. This rate of extinction may outpace the rate of speciation, leading to long-term biodiversity decline. Let's look at the example of speciation between polar bear and grizzly bear. The environmental changes, such as melting of ice caps, forced the polar bear to move south from the north pole of Earth, while grizzly bears are moving towards the north. Now, The polar bear and grizzly bears are interbreeding with each other, creating a hybrid called the grizzly bear. Over time, if the environmental pressure continues, these hybrids could evolve into a distinct species which is able to reproduce and form their own fertile offsprings. Thus, we will end up having a new kind of bear called the grizzly bear. So the takeaway from this discussion are that the environmental changes driven by human activity and climate shift are actively influencing the process of speciation. New species may emerge as populations adapt to new conditions, or as the hybrid species may evolve in the zone where habitats overlap due to the changing ecosystems.